The fluorescent lights in St. Mary's Hospital corridor flickered with their usual tired rhythm as Sarah Martinez walked toward the emergency room. Her white nursing shoes squeaked against the polished linoleum floor, a sound she had grown accustomed to after 12 years of working the night shift. At 34, Sarah had seen enough human suffering to last several lifetimes, yet she continued to show up every evening with the same dedication that had earned her the respect of doctors, patients, and fellow nurses alike. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. as Sarah checked her watch one more time. She was running slightly behind schedule, having stayed late to comfort Mrs. Thompson in room 302, an elderly woman who had been admitted earlier that day with chest pains. The woman's family lived 3 states away, and Sarah couldn't bear the thought of leaving her alone during those frightening first hours in the hospital. As she rounded the corner near the main entrance, Sarah noticed something unusual. The security guard who typically sat at the front desk was nowhere to be seen. The area seemed quieter than normal, even for a weeknight. She made a mental note to check with administration about the missing guard when she had a moment. The emergency room doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and Sarah was immediately greeted by the familiar chaos of her workplace. 2 ambulances had arrived within minutes of each other, bringing in victims of a car accident on the interstate. The medical team was already in full motion, their movements precise and coordinated despite the apparent urgency of the situation. Dr. James Chen, the head of emergency medicine, looked up from the patient he was examining and caught Sarah's eye. "Sarah, thank God you're here. We need you in Trauma Bay 3. Motorcycle accident, 22-year-old male, possible internal bleeding." Sarah nodded and immediately shifted into professional mode. She quickly washed her hands and grabbed a fresh pair of gloves from the dispenser near the entrance. As she made her way to Trauma Bay 3, she could hear the familiar sounds of medical equipment beeping and the urgent voices of her colleagues working to save lives. The young man on the gurney was conscious but clearly in significant pain. His motorcycle leathers had been cut away, revealing multiple abrasions and what appeared to be a serious leg injury. Sarah took her position beside the gurney and began her assessment, speaking in the calm, reassuring voice that had comforted countless patients over the years. "Hi there, I'm Sarah, and I'm going to be taking care of you tonight," she said, placing a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "Can you tell me your name?" "Marcus," the patient replied through gritted teeth. "Marcus Williams. Is my bike okay? I just bought it last month." Sarah smiled softly, recognizing the common concern of motorcycle accident victims. "Let's focus on getting you feeling better first, Marcus. Your bike can be replaced, but you can't be." For the next 2 hours, Sarah worked alongside Dr. Chen and the rest of the trauma team to stabilize Marcus. X-rays revealed a compound fracture of his left tibia and fibula, along with several broken ribs. While serious, his injuries were not life-threatening, and the team was able to get him ready for surgery to repair his leg. As Marcus was wheeled up to the operating room, Sarah finally had a moment to catch her breath. She walked to the small break room adjacent to the emergency department and poured herself a cup of the hospital's notoriously strong coffee. The caffeine was necessary fuel for the long nights, even though she had never developed a taste for the bitter brew. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her younger sister, Elena, who was studying nursing at the community college. "How's work tonight, sis? Any interesting cases?" Sarah smiled as she typed back, "Motorcycle accident. Kid's going to be fine, but it could have been much worse. Make sure you always wear your helmet when you ride with Jake." Elena's boyfriend Jake had a motorcycle, and Sarah worried constantly about her sister's safety. She had seen too many preventable injuries and deaths to take any risks lightly. The conversation with Elena reminded Sarah of why she had chosen nursing in the first place. Growing up in a low-income neighborhood, she had watched her mother struggle with diabetes complications that could have been prevented with better healthcare access. Her mother had died when Sarah was just 22, and the experience had motivated her to dedicate her life to helping others navigate the healthcare system. After finishing her coffee, Sarah returned to the emergency department to check on her other patients. Mrs. Rodriguez, an 80-year-old woman with pneumonia, was responding well to antibiotics. Mr. Patterson, a construction worker who had injured his back lifting heavy equipment, was waiting for his pain medication to take effect so he could go home. It was during her rounds that Sarah first noticed him. A man in his late 30s sat in the waiting area, wearing a dark hoodie despite the warm evening. He kept his head down, occasionally glancing around the room with what appeared to be nervous energy. Something about his behavior struck Sarah as odd, but emergency room waiting areas attracted all types of people at all hours, and she had learned not to judge based on appearances alone. The man had been there when she arrived for her shift, and now, nearly 3 hours later, he was still sitting in the same chair. He hadn't approached the reception desk or spoken to any of the staff. Most people who sat in emergency room waiting areas for hours were either accompanying family members or were patients themselves waiting to be seen. This man appeared to be alone and showed no signs of injury or illness. Sarah made her way to the reception desk, where Jenny, the night receptionist, was updating patient files on her computer. Jenny had worked at St. Mary's for 8 years and had developed a keen sense for identifying people who might cause problems.
"Jenny, do you know anything about the guy in the dark hoodie?" Sarah asked quietly, nodding toward the waiting area. "He's been sitting there since I arrived."
Jenny looked up from her computer screen and glanced toward the man.
"Yeah, I noticed him too. He came in around 9:30 and said he was waiting for someone, but that was hours ago. I asked him a couple of times if he needed help, and he just said he was fine." "Has he used his phone or shown any signs of actually waiting for someone?" "Not that I've seen."
And here's the strange part, when I asked for his name earlier, he hesitated before answering. Said his name was John Smith, which, could be real, but it seemed rehearsed. Sarah felt a small knot of unease forming in her stomach. In her years of working in hospitals, she had developed an intuition about people and situations that might be dangerous. This man's behavior was setting off alarm bells in her mind.
"Where's security tonight?" Sarah asked. "I noticed the front desk was empty when I came in."
Mike called in sick, and the replacement they sent went home early.
"Something about a family emergency."
"We've been without security for the past 2 hours.
This information only increased Sarah's concern. Hospital security wasn't just about preventing theft or managing unruly patients.
Security guards often served as a deterrent to people with bad intentions and provided a sense of safety for staff working late-night shifts. "Maybe I should call the police and ask them to do a welfare check," Sarah suggested.
"I thought about that too, but what would we tell them? A guy is sitting quietly in our waiting room? They'd probably think we were overreacting." Sarah knew Jenny was right.
The police had more pressing matters to deal with than investigating people who were technically doing nothing wrong.
Still, her instincts told her that something wasn't right about the situation. As if sensing that he was being discussed, the man in the hoodie looked up and made brief eye contact with Sarah.
She felt a chill run down her spine. His eyes were cold and calculating, not the eyes of someone innocently waiting for a friend or family member. The man stood up from his chair and walked toward the reception desk. Sarah's heart rate increased as he approached, and she found herself mentally calculating the distance to the nearest exit and the location of the panic button behind the reception desk.
"Excuse me," the man said, his voice surprisingly soft and polite. "I was wondering if you could help me find someone. My cousin was supposed to meet me here, but I can't seem to reach him on his phone." "What's your cousin's name?"
Jenny asked, her professional smile masking any concern she might have felt.
"David Martinez," the man replied without hesitation. Sarah's blood turned cold.
Martinez was her last name, though it was common enough that the coincidence might mean nothing. However, the way the man's eyes remained fixed on her face while he spoke suggested that the name choice was not random. "I'll check our patient records," Jenny said, turning to her computer.
"When was your cousin supposed to arrive?"
"A couple of hours ago. He said he was coming to visit a nurse who works here."
"Sarah Martinez, I think her name was." The knot in Sarah's stomach tightened into a hard ball of fear.
This man knew her name, and he had been sitting in the waiting room watching her work for hours. Every instinct she had developed over years of working in potentially dangerous situations was screaming at her to get away from this man as quickly as possible.
I'm sorry, but we don't have any patients by that name, and I can't provide information about our staff members, Jenny replied, her voice remaining steady despite the obvious tension in the situation.
The man's polite demeanor began to slip slightly. His smile became forced, and Sarah noticed his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Are you sure? Maybe you could ask Sarah Martinez if she knows anything about my cousin?
I'm afraid that's not possible, Jenny said firmly. If your cousin isn't here, you might want to try calling him again or checking with other family members. Sarah realized that she needed to remove herself from the situation immediately. She began backing away from the reception desk, planning to retreat to the staff area where she could call security or the police. However, the man noticed her movement and turned his full attention to her. You're Sarah Martinez, aren't you? He said, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone.
Sarah's training kicked in.
In situations involving potentially dangerous individuals, the recommended response was to remain calm, avoid confrontation, and seek help as quickly as possible. However, the man was now blocking her most direct path to safety. I'm sorry, but I need to get back to my patients, Sarah said, attempting to keep her voice steady.
Jenny can help you with any questions about hospital policies.
The man took a step closer to Sarah, and she noticed a bulge under his hoodie that she hadn't seen before. Her mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. The bulge could be a weapon of some kind. I think we need to talk, the man said, his pretense of politeness completely gone now.
About what happened to my brother?
Sarah had no idea what the man was talking about, but it was clear that he believed she had some connection to whatever incident he was referencing. The situation was escalating rapidly, and she knew that she needed to get help immediately. Jenny, please call security, Sarah said loudly enough for other people in the waiting area to hear. She hoped that drawing attention to the situation might deter the man from doing whatever he was planning. Security won't help you, the man said with a cold smile.
They're not here tonight, remember?
The fact that he knew about the absence of security confirmed Sarah's worst fears. This man had been planning whatever was about to happen, and he had chosen his timing carefully.
Sarah's mind raced through her options.
The emergency department was busy with medical staff, but they were all focused on their patients and unlikely to notice a conversation in the waiting area unless it became obviously violent. The nearest exit was behind the man, blocked by his position. The panic button was behind the reception desk, but reaching it would require getting past both the man and the reception counter.
I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding, Sarah said, still trying to de-escalate the situation through calm communication.
I don't know anyone named David Martinez, and I don't know anything about your brother. Don't lie to me, the man suddenly shouted, causing several people in the waiting area to look up from their phones and magazines.
You were there that night. You let him die. Sarah's confusion was genuine.
She had no idea what night the man was referring to or who his brother was supposed to be. However, it was becoming clear that he blamed her for someone's death and had come to the hospital with the intention of confronting her about it. Jenny had quietly picked up the phone behind the reception desk and was speaking in hushed tones, presumably calling the police. However, Sarah knew that it would take several minutes for officers to arrive, and she wasn't sure how long she could keep the man talking before he decided to take whatever action he was planning. Please help me understand, Sarah said, trying to keep him engaged in conversation.
What's your brother's name? Maybe if you tell me more about what happened, we can figure this out together.
The man's eyes filled with tears, and, for a moment, his anger was replaced by grief.
Tommy Rodriguez.
He was only 19 years old.
Sarah searched her memory for any patient named Tommy Rodriguez.
The name sounded familiar, but she had treated hundreds of patients over the years, and many of the names blended together in her mind. When did this happen? She asked gently.
6 months ago.
He was brought here after the accident, and you were supposed to take care of him.
But you didn't save him.
You let him die, and now his daughter will grow up without a father. Suddenly, the memory came flooding back to Sarah.
Tommy Rodriguez had been brought to the emergency room after a construction accident.
A scaffolding had collapsed, and he had suffered massive internal injuries. Sarah had been part of the team that worked on him, but his injuries were too severe. Despite hours of surgery and the best efforts of the entire medical team, Tommy had died on the operating table.
I remember Tommy, Sarah said softly. I was there that night. We did everything we could to save him.
You didn't do enough, the man screamed, reaching under his hoodie and pulling out a handgun.
He was supposed to come home to his family.
Panic erupted in the waiting room as people saw the gun and began screaming and running toward the exits. Sarah froze, staring at the weapon pointed directly at her chest. Her 12 years of medical training had prepared her for many emergencies, but facing an armed man seeking revenge was not one of them. Please, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper.
I know you're hurting. I know you miss Tommy.
But this won't bring him back. Maybe not, the man replied, his hand shaking as he held the gun.
But it will make sure you can't let anyone else die. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah watched the man's finger move toward the trigger.
She thought about her sister Elena, who would be devastated to lose another family member. She thought about her patients who depended on her care. She thought about all the lives she had helped save over the years and wondered if that would be enough to balance whatever was about to happen.
The first shot rang out like thunder in the enclosed space of the hospital corridor.
Sarah felt the bullet tear through her shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing into the wall behind the reception desk. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but her medical training kicked in even as she fell. She needed to apply pressure to the wound to control the bleeding. The second shot hit her in the abdomen as she tried to take cover behind the reception desk. This wound was more serious, and Sarah could feel the warm blood spreading across her scrubs. She pressed her hand against the injury, trying to maintain pressure while simultaneously attempting to crawl toward safety. Through the chaos and screaming, Sarah could hear Jenny on the phone with emergency services, shouting their location and describing the situation. The sound of running feet echoed through the corridor as hospital staff and patients fled the area. The third shot caught Sarah in the leg as she attempted to crawl toward the staff entrance. The bullet shattered her femur, and the pain was so intense that she nearly lost consciousness. Her vision began to blur, and she could feel her strength draining away with each heartbeat. Dr. Chen appeared at the edge of Sarah's vision, having heard the gunshots from the trauma bay where he had been working. He immediately began crawling toward her, staying low to avoid becoming a target himself.
Sarah, stay with me, he called out. We're going to get you out of this.
The fourth shot was aimed at Dr. Chen, but it struck Sarah in the chest instead as she instinctively tried to shield her colleague. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, and she could taste blood in her mouth. She knew that this wound was potentially fatal, and her thoughts turned to her family and the patients she would never be able to help again.
As Dr. Chen reached Sarah's position, the gunman fired his fifth and final shot.
This bullet struck Sarah in the neck, and she could feel her consciousness beginning to slip away. The last thing she heard before everything went dark was the sound of police sirens in the distance and Dr. Chen shouting for someone to bring a gurney.
The corridor fell silent except for the sound of Sarah's labored breathing and the approaching sirens.
Jenny, still crouched behind the reception desk, watched in horror as the gunman stood over Sarah's motionless body for a moment before turning the weapon on himself. The nightmare was over, but, for Sarah Martinez, the real fight for survival was just beginning.
The emergency room that had been Sarah's workplace for 12 years was now transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape blocked the main entrance while police officers interviewed witnesses and collected evidence.
But, for the medical team at St. Mary's Hospital, the investigation was secondary to their primary mission, saving the life of one of their own. Dr. James Chen had worked alongside Sarah for 8 years, and he refused to let emotion cloud his judgment as he assessed her injuries. 5 gunshot wounds created a complex medical puzzle that would require every bit of skill and experience the trauma team possessed. As Sarah was rushed into Trauma Bay 1, the same bay where she had treated countless patients, Dr. Chen began barking orders to the assembled medical staff. I need 2 units of O-negative blood immediately, he called out to the blood bank technician who had been summoned from home. Get me a chest tube tray and prep for emergency surgery. Someone call Dr. Williams and tell him we need him here now.
Nurse Patricia Gonzalez, Sarah's closest friend among the hospital staff, took her position at Sarah's side despite the tears streaming down her face.
Patricia had started working at St. Mary's just 6 months after Sarah, and the two women had supported each other through countless difficult shifts, personal challenges, and the daily stress of emergency medicine. "Her blood pressure is dropping fast," Patricia reported, checking the monitors that displayed Sarah's vital signs.
"Pulse is thready and weak."
Dr. Chen examined the gunshot wounds systematically, starting with the most life-threatening injuries. The shot to Sarah's chest had punctured her right lung, causing it to collapse. The abdominal wound appeared to have damaged several internal organs, and blood was pooling in her abdomen. The neck wound, while missing major arteries, had caused significant tissue damage and swelling that could compromise her airway. "We need to get her to surgery immediately," Dr. Chen announced.
"Patricia, call the OR and tell them we're coming up. This is going to be a long night."
As the trauma team prepared to move Sarah to the operating room, the hospital's administrator, Margaret Foster, arrived at the scene. Margaret had worked in hospital administration for 25 years, but she had never dealt with a situation where one of her staff members had been the victim of such a violent attack.
"How is she?" Margaret asked Dr. Chen as they walked quickly toward the elevators.
"Critical but stable for now," Dr. Chen replied grimly.
"The next few hours will be crucial.
We need to control the bleeding and repair the damage, but with injuries this extensive, there are no guarantees." The elevator ride to the surgical floor was completed in tense silence. Patricia held Sarah's hand, whispering words of encouragement even though Sarah remained unconscious.
Dr.
Chen used the time to mentally prepare for what he knew would be one of the most challenging surgeries of his career. Dr. Michael Williams, the hospital's chief of surgery, was waiting when they arrived at the operating room. At 62 years old, Dr. Williams had performed thousands of surgeries and was known for his ability to remain calm under pressure.
However, even he was shaken by the sight of Sarah's injuries. "What's our situation?"
Dr. Williams asked as they transferred Sarah to the operating table.
5 gunshot wounds, Dr. Chen replied, providing a rapid assessment. "Chest, abdomen, shoulder, leg, and neck."
The chest wound has caused a pneumothorax, and there's significant internal bleeding in the abdomen. The leg wound has shattered the femur. Dr. Williams nodded grimly.
"We'll need to prioritize. Chest and abdomen first, then we can work on the extremities."
"How much blood has she lost?" "Best estimate is about 40% of her blood volume," Dr. Chen replied. "We're replacing fluids and blood products as fast as we can." As the surgical team prepared for the operation, word of the shooting began to spread throughout the hospital. Sarah was well known and respected by staff members in every department. She had mentored new nurses, covered extra shifts when colleagues were sick, and always volunteered to work during holidays so that other staff members could spend time with their families. Dr. Lisa Park, the hospital's psychiatrist, heard about the shooting from a colleague and immediately made her way to the surgical floor. She knew that the emotional trauma of witnessing the attack would affect everyone who had been present, and she wanted to be available to provide support. Meanwhile, in the hospital's break room, Jenny sat with a police detective, recounting the events that had led up to the shooting. Her hands shook as she described the gunman's behavior and his claim that Sarah was responsible for his brother's death. He said his name was Rodriguez, Jenny told Detective Martinez, who had arrived as part of the response team. He was angry about his brother Tommy, who apparently died here 6 months ago.
Detective Martinez made notes in his notebook. "Do you know anything about this case? Was there any negligence or malpractice involved?" "Absolutely not," Jenny replied firmly. "I remember when Tommy Rodriguez was brought in. Everyone did everything they could to save him, but his injuries were too severe. Sarah worked on him for hours." The detective nodded. Sometimes grief makes people look for someone to blame, even when the death was unavoidable.
In the operating room, Dr. Williams and his team worked with precise efficiency to address Sarah's injuries. They began by repairing the collapsed lung, inserting a chest tube to remove the blood and air that had accumulated in her chest cavity. The immediate improvement in her breathing was encouraging, but they knew that the abdominal injuries would be more challenging. "I can see damage to the liver and small intestine," Dr. Williams reported as he examined Sarah's abdomen. "We're going to need to remove several inches of damaged bowel and repair a significant tear in the liver."
The surgery continued for 4 hours as the team methodically addressed each injury.
The femur fracture required the insertion of a metal rod to stabilize the bone, while the shoulder wound needed cleaning and repair of damaged muscle tissue. The neck wound, while concerning due to the swelling, had fortunately missed the major blood vessels and airways.
During the surgery, Sarah's family began arriving at the hospital.
Her sister Elena, who had been asleep when the police called, drove to the hospital in a state of shock and disbelief. She couldn't comprehend how her sister, who dedicated her life to helping others, could become the victim of such senseless violence. Elena was met in the waiting room by Father Miguel Santos, the hospital chaplain, who had been called to provide spiritual support for the family and staff. Father Santos had worked at St. Mary's for 15 years and had comforted countless families during their darkest moments. "Elena, I'm so sorry about what happened to Sarah," Father Santos said gently. "She's receiving the best possible care from a team of doctors who know and respect her." "I don't understand," Elena said through her tears.
"Why would someone want to hurt Sarah? She's never done anything but help people."
"Sometimes people in pain make choices that don't make sense to the rest of us," Father Santos replied. "What's important now is that Sarah is surrounded by people who care about her and are fighting to save her life."
As news of the shooting spread beyond the hospital, Sarah's story began to capture public attention.
Local news stations picked up the story of a dedicated nurse who had been shot while working to save lives. Social media posts began appearing with messages of support and prayers for Sarah's recovery. The mayor of the city, Robert Harrison, issued a statement condemning the violence and praising the dedication of healthcare workers like Sarah. "Our nurses and doctors risk their lives every day to care for others," the statement read. "This senseless act of violence against someone who has devoted her career to healing is particularly heartbreaking." Back in the operating room, the surgical team was making steady progress. Dr. Williams had successfully repaired the liver damage and removed the damaged portion of Sarah's intestine. The chest wound was healing well, and her breathing had stabilized. However, the cumulative effect of 5 gunshot wounds had placed enormous stress on Sarah's body. "Her blood pressure is starting to improve," the anesthesiologist reported. "But she's still critical.
The next 24 hours will be crucial for determining whether she can recover from this trauma."
Patricia had remained in the surgical suite throughout the operation, monitoring Sarah's vital signs and providing assistance to the surgical team. Despite her emotional connection to the patient, she maintained her professional composure and contributed valuable insights about Sarah's medical history and normal baseline values. As the surgery concluded, Dr. Williams addressed the assembled team.
"This was excellent work, everyone.
We've addressed all the major injuries, but Sarah still faces a long road to recovery. She'll need intensive monitoring and likely several additional procedures." Sarah was transferred to the intensive care unit, where she would be monitored around the clock by specialized nurses and physicians. The ICU was equipped with the most advanced monitoring equipment available, allowing the medical team to track every aspect of Sarah's condition in real time.
Dr.
Amanda Foster, the hospital's chief of critical care medicine, assumed responsibility for Sarah's ongoing care. Dr. Foster had treated numerous patients with multiple gunshot wounds during her career, and she understood the complex medical challenges that Sarah would face during her recovery. "The surgery went well, but she's not out of danger yet," Dr. Foster explained to Elena and the other family members who had gathered in the waiting room. "The next few days will be critical as her body attempts to heal from these extensive injuries."
Elena nodded, trying to process the medical information while dealing with the emotional trauma of nearly losing her sister. "Can I see her?"
"She's sedated and on a ventilator right now, but you can visit for a few minutes," Dr. Foster replied.
"She may be able to hear you even though she can't respond."
When Elena entered the ICU room, she was shocked by the sight of her strong, vibrant sister surrounded by machines and tubes. Sarah's face was pale and swollen, and the steady beeping of the monitors provided a constant reminder of how close she had come to death. "I'm here, Sarah," Elena whispered, taking her sister's hand.
"Everyone is praying for you.
The doctors say you're going to be okay, and I believe them.
You're the strongest person I know.
Outside Sarah's room, the hospital staff struggled to process what had happened to their colleague. Many of them had been present during the shooting, and several required counseling to deal with the psychological trauma of witnessing such violence in their workplace. Dr. Park had set up a temporary counseling center in one of the conference rooms, where staff members could talk about their experiences and receive support. She knew that the emotional impact of the shooting would extend far beyond the physical injuries suffered by Sarah. It's normal to feel scared, angry, or confused after witnessing something like this, Dr. Park told a group of emergency room staff. What happened tonight was traumatic for everyone, and it's important that we support each other through the healing process. Nurse Patricia, despite her own emotional trauma, took on the role of coordinating support for Sarah's family. She organized a schedule of staff members who would stay with Elena and other family members throughout the night, ensuring that they would not have to face this crisis alone.
Sarah has been there for all of us at some point, Patricia told her colleagues. Now it's our turn to be there for her family. As the night progressed, cards and flowers began arriving from other hospitals, nursing organizations, and community groups. The story of Sarah's dedication to her patients and the senseless attack that nearly cost her life resonated with healthcare workers throughout the region. Dr. Thomas Reed, the president of the State Nursing Association, drove 3 hours to visit Sarah and show support for her family. Sarah represents the best of our profession, he told Elena.
She's dedicated her life to caring for others, and now the entire nursing community is rallying to support her. The police investigation continued throughout the night as detectives worked to understand the gunman's motivations and determine whether there were any security failures that had contributed to the attack. Detective Martinez interviewed hospital staff and reviewed security footage to piece together a timeline of events. The investigation revealed that the gunman, whose name was Carlos Rodriguez, had been planning the attack for several weeks. He had visited the hospital multiple times to observe security procedures and staff schedules. His brother Tommy's death had sent him into a deep depression, and he had become convinced that Sarah and the medical team were responsible for not saving Tommy's life. He had no prior criminal history, Detective Martinez explained to hospital administrators.
This appears to have been an isolated incident driven by grief and mental illness rather than any organized threat to the hospital. As dawn broke over the city, Sarah remained in critical condition in the ICU. Her vital signs had stabilized somewhat, but she was still dependent on life support equipment and faced a long and uncertain recovery. The immediate crisis had passed, but the real challenges were just beginning. Elena had spent the entire night at her sister's bedside, holding her hand and talking to her despite the doctor's uncertainty about whether Sarah could hear anything. As the morning light filtered through the hospital windows, Elena made a promise to herself and to Sarah. "I'm going to be here every step of the way," she whispered. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we're going to get through this together." The shooting at St. Mary's Hospital had shocked the entire community and raised difficult questions about security and the safety of healthcare workers. But, for now, all attention was focused on one brave nurse whose life hung in the balance, and the determined medical team fighting to save her. 3 days had passed since the shooting, and Sarah Martinez remained unconscious in the intensive care unit. The machines surrounding her bed continued their steady rhythm, monitoring every heartbeat and breath while her body fought to heal from the devastating injuries. Elena had barely left her sister's side, surviving on hospital cafeteria coffee and brief naps in the uncomfortable chair beside Sarah's bed. Dr.
Foster made her morning rounds, carefully examining Sarah's progress and adjusting medications as needed. The chest wound was healing well, and the collapsed lung had fully re-expanded. The abdominal surgery had been successful, though Sarah would require additional procedures to fully repair the damage. However, it was the psychological impact of the trauma that concerned Dr. Foster most.
"Has there been any change in her responsiveness?"
Dr. Foster asked the night nurse, who was completing her documentation before the shift change. She moved her fingers a few times during the night, and her eyes showed some rapid movement during what appeared to be dream states, the nurse reported. But she hasn't responded to verbal commands or shown signs of consciousness. Dr. Foster nodded, making notes in Sarah's chart. The sedation medications can sometimes mask signs of consciousness. We'll start reducing them gradually today and see how she responds. Elena looked up from her position beside the bed, hope evident in her tired eyes.
Does that mean she might wake up soon?
It's possible, Dr. Foster replied carefully. But we need to be prepared for the fact that recovering from this type of trauma takes time. When Sarah does wake up, she may be confused or have difficulty remembering what happened.
As Dr. Foster continued her rounds, Elena returned her attention to Sarah.
She had been talking to her sister constantly, sharing memories from their childhood and updates about the overwhelming support they had received from the community. Hundreds of cards and flowers had arrived from people who had heard about Sarah's story, and the hospital had set up a special room just to house all the gifts. The local elementary school sent a box of drawings, Elena told Sarah, holding up a colorful picture of a nurse with a cape like a superhero. This little girl named Maria drew you with a cape because she says nurses are heroes who save people.
The drawing was one of dozens that had arrived from children throughout the city.
Teachers had used Sarah's story as an opportunity to discuss the importance of healthcare workers and the courage it takes to help others even when it's dangerous. Meanwhile, the investigation into the shooting had revealed troubling details about the hospital's security procedures. Detective Martinez had discovered that Carlos Rodriguez had been able to access the hospital multiple times over several weeks without being questioned or asked to provide identification. The lack of security guards on the night of the shooting had made the attack possible. Margaret Foster, the hospital administrator, was meeting with the board of directors to address the security failures and implement new safety measures. The shooting had exposed significant vulnerabilities in the hospital's protection of both patients and staff.
We need metal detectors at all entrances, board member Dr. Janet Williams argued during the emergency meeting.
And we need security guards present 24 hours a day, not just during business hours.
Those measures would be expensive, replied board member Robert Chen, the hospital's financial director.
We're already operating on thin margins, and additional security costs could impact our ability to provide medical services. Margaret understood the financial concerns, but she also knew that the hospital had a moral and legal obligation to protect its staff and patients. We can't put a price on safety, she said firmly. If we had proper security in place, Sarah's attack might have been prevented. The board ultimately approved a comprehensive security upgrade that would include metal detectors, additional security personnel, and improved training for staff members on identifying potentially dangerous situations. However, the implementation of these changes would take several months, and the psychological impact of the shooting would last much longer. Back in the ICU, Dr. Park was making her daily visit to assess Sarah's psychological state and provide support for Elena. The psychiatrist had been monitoring Sarah's brain activity and was encouraged by signs that suggested she was processing information even while unconscious.
Brain scans show normal activity patterns, Dr. Park explained to Elena.
The areas responsible for memory and cognition appear to be functioning well, which is a positive sign for her long-term recovery. Elena felt a wave of relief at this news. She had been terrified that the bullet wound to Sarah's neck might have caused brain damage that would permanently change her sister's personality or cognitive abilities.
When she wakes up, will she remember what happened? Elena asked.
It's difficult to predict, Dr. Park replied honestly.
Some trauma patients have clear memories of their attacks, while others experience partial or complete amnesia about the event.
In many ways, forgetting can be a protective mechanism that helps the mind cope with overwhelming trauma.
As the afternoon wore on, Elena noticed subtle changes in Sarah's condition.
Her sister's eyes seemed to be moving more frequently beneath her closed eyelids, and her fingers occasionally twitched in response to Elena's voice.
These small signs gave Elena hope that Sarah was beginning to emerge from the depths of unconsciousness.
Dr. Foster had ordered the gradual reduction of Sarah's sedation medications, and the nursing staff was monitoring her closely for signs of awakening. If Sarah regained consciousness, she would likely be confused and possibly frightened by her surroundings and the medical equipment keeping her alive. Patricia had volunteered to be present when Sarah woke up, knowing that seeing a familiar face would provide comfort during those crucial first moments of consciousness. Despite her own emotional trauma from witnessing the shooting, Patricia had thrown herself into supporting Sarah's recovery and caring for her family. I've arranged for you to take a shower and get some real food, Patricia told Elena during her evening visit. I'll stay with Sarah while you take care of yourself. Elena was reluctant to leave her sister's side, but she knew that Patricia was right. She hadn't had a proper meal or shower since the shooting, and she needed to maintain her own health if she was going to be strong enough to support Sarah through her recovery. While Elena was away, Patricia sat beside Sarah's bed and began talking to her about their shared experiences working at the hospital. She described some of the patients they had saved together and reminded Sarah of the positive impact she had made on countless lives.
Remember Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who came in with chest pains last month?
Patricia said softly. You stayed with her for 2 hours after your shift ended because she was scared and alone. Her daughter called the hospital the next day to thank you specifically for your kindness. As Patricia spoke, she noticed Sarah's heart rate increasing slightly on the monitor. It was a subtle change, but one that suggested Sarah might be responding to familiar voices and memories. I know you can hear me, Sarah, Patricia continued.
Everyone is praying for you and waiting for you to wake up. You've got so many people who love you and need you to get better. Suddenly, Sarah's eyes fluttered open for just a moment before closing again.
Patricia's heart raced as she pressed the call button to summon the medical team. It was the first sign of consciousness they had seen since the surgery. Dr. Foster arrived within minutes, along with 2 ICU nurses who began assessing Sarah's neurological responses. They used a small flashlight to check her pupil reactions and tested her reflexes to evaluate brain function.
Sarah, can you hear me?
Dr. Foster said in a clear, calm voice.
If you can hear me, try to squeeze my hand. For several seconds, there was no response.
Then, slowly, Sarah's fingers closed around Dr. Foster's hand in a weak but unmistakable squeeze. Patricia felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she witnessed this first sign that Sarah was truly fighting her way back to consciousness. The squeeze was barely perceptible, but it represented a crucial step in her recovery. Elena returned from her break to find the medical team gathered around Sarah's bed and immediately feared the worst. However, her panic turned to overwhelming relief when Patricia explained what had happened. She squeezed Dr. Foster's hand, Patricia said excitedly.
She's starting to wake up.
Over the next few hours, Sarah showed increasing signs of consciousness. Her eyes opened more frequently and for longer periods, and she began responding to simple commands like moving her fingers or toes. However, she remained unable to speak due to the breathing tube that was still helping her lungs function properly. Dr. Foster was cautiously optimistic about Sarah's progress.
This is exactly what we want to see, she told Elena.
Her brain function appears to be intact, and she's showing good motor responses. We'll continue monitoring her closely, but this is very encouraging. The news of Sarah's awakening spread quickly throughout the hospital, bringing smiles and tears of relief from staff members who had been deeply affected by the shooting.
Many of them stopped by the ICU waiting room to check on Elena and express their continued support for Sarah's recovery. However, Dr. Foster knew that Sarah's psychological recovery would be just as challenging as her physical healing.
Waking up to find herself severely injured and dependent on life support would be traumatic, and Sarah would need extensive counseling to process what had happened to her. When we remove the breathing tube, she may have questions about the shooting, Dr. Foster warned Elena. It's important that we answer her honestly but gently. She needs to understand what happened, but we don't want to overwhelm her with too much information at once. The decision to remove Sarah's breathing tube came on her 5th day in the ICU. Her lung function had improved significantly, and she was showing strong enough reflexes to breathe on her own. Dr. Foster performed the procedure while Elena and Patricia waited anxiously nearby. Sarah's first words were barely a whisper, but they brought tears to everyone present.
Elena, she asked weakly, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube.
I'm here, Elena replied, moving quickly to her sister's side.
I'm right here, and you're safe now.
Sarah's eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the medical equipment and the concerned faces of the people surrounding her.
What happened? She asked, though her voice was so weak that Elena had to lean close to hear her.
You were hurt at work, Elena explained gently.
But the doctors fixed you up, and you're going to be okay.
Sarah tried to sit up but immediately winced in pain from her injuries. The reality of her condition began to sink in as she became aware of the bandages covering her body and the pain from her multiple wounds. "The patient," Sarah said suddenly, her nursing instincts overriding her own concerns.
"Marcus. The motorcycle accident. Is he okay?" Patricia smiled through her tears, amazed that Sarah's first concern was for her patient rather than herself. "Marcus is fine.
He had his surgery and went home 2 days ago."
"You saved his life."
Over the next few hours, Dr. Foster and the medical team gradually explained to Sarah what had happened during the shooting. They were careful to provide information slowly, allowing her time to process each piece of the story before continuing.
Sarah's reaction to learning about the attack was a mixture of sadness, confusion, and guilt.
She remembered Tommy Rodriguez and the night he died, and she understood the grief that his brother Carlos must have felt. However, she also struggled to comprehend why that grief had led to such violence. "I tried to save Tommy," Sarah said weakly, tears rolling down her cheeks.
"We all did.
But his injuries were too severe.
There wasn't anything more we could do."
Elena held her sister's hand tightly, providing comfort as Sarah grappled with the knowledge that someone had tried to kill her because they blamed her for a death she couldn't have prevented.
Dr.
Park visited Sarah later that day to begin the process of psychological counseling. The psychiatrist knew that Sarah would need professional support to deal with the trauma of being shot and the guilt she might feel about Carlos Rodriguez's death. "It's natural to have complicated feelings about what happened," Dr. Park told Sarah. "You're a healthcare provider who dedicated your life to saving others, and someone tried to kill you because they believed you had failed to save their loved one. That's an incredibly difficult situation to process emotionally." Sarah nodded weakly, though she was clearly struggling with exhaustion from the simple act of staying awake and talking. The path to recovery would be long and difficult, but, for the first time since the shooting, there was genuine hope that she would not only survive but eventually return to the work she loved. As evening approached and Sarah drifted off to sleep, Elena remained at her bedside. The worst of the crisis had passed, but she knew that the real work of healing, both physical and emotional, was just beginning. Sarah had survived 5 gunshot wounds, but now she would have to find the strength to rebuild her life and somehow make sense of the senseless violence that had nearly destroyed it. 2 weeks after regaining consciousness, Sarah Martinez was transferred from the intensive care unit to a private room on the hospital's medical floor. The move represented significant progress in her physical recovery, though the psychological challenges of her ordeal were becoming increasingly apparent. Elena had taken leave from her nursing program to care for her sister, and the family had received an outpouring of support from the community that continued to grow each day. Sarah's room was filled with flowers, cards, and gifts from people around the world who had heard her story through news reports and social media. A local news station had featured her case in a segment about violence against healthcare workers, and the story had been picked up by national outlets. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had always preferred to work quietly behind the scenes. "I never wanted to be famous," Sarah told Elena as they looked through the latest batch of cards that had arrived. "I just wanted to help people." Elena smiled as she read a card from a group of nurses in California who had organized a fundraiser for Sarah's medical expenses. "You are helping people. Your story is inspiring others to appreciate healthcare workers and to think about how we treat each other when we're grieving or angry." The physical therapy began during Sarah's second week on the medical floor. The gunshot wound to her leg had caused significant muscle and bone damage, and she would need months of rehabilitation to regain full mobility. The therapist, Maria Santos, was a gentle woman in her 50s who had worked with many trauma patients over her 20-year career. "We're going to start slowly," Maria explained during their first session. "The goal isn't to push yourself too hard but to gradually rebuild your strength and range of motion." Sarah's first attempts at walking were painful and frustrating. The simple act of standing required tremendous effort, and taking even a few steps left her exhausted. However, she was determined to recover as completely as possible, driven by her desire to eventually return to nursing. "I need to get back to work," Sarah told Maria during one particularly difficult therapy session. "My patients need me."
Maria understood Sarah's motivation, but she also knew that recovery couldn't be rushed. Your patients need you to be healthy and strong. If you push too hard too fast, you could injure yourself and delay your recovery even more. The psychological counseling sessions with Dr. Park were equally challenging.
Sarah struggled with feelings of guilt about Carlos Rodriguez's death, even though she understood intellectually that his actions were not her fault. She also experienced nightmares about the shooting and anxiety attacks when she heard unexpected loud noises. It's common for trauma survivors to experience survivor's guilt, Dr. Park explained during one of their sessions. You're a healthcare provider who saves lives, so it's particularly difficult for you to accept that someone died because of their actions toward you. Sarah nodded, wiping away tears that seemed to come frequently these days. I keep thinking about Tommy Rodriguez and his family. Carlos was grieving, and, instead of getting help, he chose violence. Now his family has lost 2 people instead of 1. That's not your responsibility, Dr. Park said gently but firmly. Carlos made a choice to blame you for something that wasn't your fault, and then, he made another choice to act on that blame with violence. You are not responsible for the consequences of his decisions. The investigation into the shooting had concluded with a report that cleared Sarah and the medical team of any wrongdoing in Tommy Rodriguez's death. The medical examiner confirmed that Tommy's injuries were too severe to survive, regardless of the quality of care he received. However, the report also highlighted significant security failures at the hospital that had made the attack possible. Margaret Foster, a hospital administrator, visited Sarah regularly to provide updates on the security improvements being implemented. The hospital had installed metal detectors at all entrances, hired additional security guards, and implemented new protocols for identifying and managing potentially dangerous visitors. We're also creating a new position for a threat assessment coordinator, Margaret explained during one visit. This person will be responsible for evaluating any threats against staff members and coordinating with law enforcement when necessary. While Sarah appreciated these efforts to improve safety, she worried about the impact on the hospital's atmosphere. St. Mary's had always prided itself on being welcoming and accessible to the community, and she feared that excessive security measures might create barriers between patients and caregivers. I don't want people to be afraid to come to the hospital for help, Sarah told Margaret. Healthcare should feel safe and welcoming. We're trying to balance security with accessibility, Margaret replied. The goal is to protect our staff and patients while maintaining the caring environment that makes St. Mary's special. As Sarah's physical condition improved, she began receiving visits from colleagues and patients whose lives she had touched over the years. Marcus Williams, the young man who had been in the motorcycle accident on the night of the shooting, came to see her with his parents. He was walking with crutches but had recovered fully from his injuries. I wanted to thank you, Marcus said, struggling to find the right words. I know you got hurt that night, and I feel terrible that it happened while you were taking care of me. Sarah took his hand gently. Marcus, what happened to me had nothing to do with you or any other patient. You needed help, and I was glad to be able to provide it. That's what nurses do. Marcus's mother, Janet Williams, had tears in her eyes as she watched the interaction between her son and the nurse who had helped save his life. We've been following your story in the news, she said. You're an inspiration to all of us. These visits from grateful patients and their families helped Sarah remember why she had chosen nursing as her career. Each person she had helped represented a life that had been improved or saved, and their gratitude reminded her that the positive impact of her work far outweighed the tragedy that had befallen her. Dr. Chen also visited regularly, providing updates about changes in the emergency department and encouraging Sarah about her eventual return to work. However, he was careful not to pressure her about timing, knowing that she would need to heal emotionally as well as physically before she could handle the stress of emergency medicine again. We miss you, Dr. Chen told her during one visit. The department isn't the same without your calm presence and expertise. I miss it too, Sarah replied. But I'm not sure when I'll be ready to come back. Sometimes I have panic attacks just thinking about being in the hospital corridor where it happened. Dr. Chen nodded understandingly. Take all the time you need. When you're ready, we'll be here for you. The media attention surrounding Sarah's case had led to broader discussions about violence against healthcare workers and the need for better security in medical facilities. A group of nursing organizations had invited Sarah to speak at a national conference about her experience, but she wasn't sure she was emotionally ready for such public exposure.
They want me to tell my story to help other healthcare workers understand the risks they face, Sarah told Elena. But I don't know if I can talk about it in front of hundreds of people. Elena understood her sister's reluctance.
Sarah had always been a private person who preferred to help others quietly rather than seeking attention for her actions. However, Elena also recognized the potential impact Sarah's story could have on improving safety for healthcare workers everywhere.
Maybe you could start smaller, Elena suggested.
You could write an article or do an interview instead of speaking at a large conference. The suggestion appealed to Sarah, and she began working on an article about her experience for a nursing journal. Writing about the shooting was difficult and emotional, but it also helped her process her feelings and organize her thoughts about what had happened. In her article, Sarah emphasized the importance of treating grieving families with compassion while also maintaining appropriate security measures. She wrote about the need for better mental health resources for people dealing with loss and trauma, suggesting that if Carlos Rodriguez had received proper counseling after his brother's death, the violence might have been prevented.
Grief can make people desperate for someone to blame, Sarah wrote.
As healthcare providers, we need to understand that families may direct their anger at us when we can't save their loved ones. But we also need systems in place to protect ourselves from those rare individuals who might act on that anger with violence. The article was published in the American Journal of Nursing and was widely read by healthcare professionals around the country. Many readers reached out to Sarah with their own stories of threats or violence they had experienced, helping her realize that her case, while extreme, was part of a larger pattern of aggression against healthcare workers.
Meanwhile, Sarah's physical recovery continued steadily. After 6 weeks in the hospital, she was finally able to go home, though she still required daily physical therapy and regular medical checkups. Elena had moved in temporarily to help with daily tasks that Sarah couldn't yet manage on her own.
The transition to home was both exciting and challenging. Sarah was grateful to be in familiar surroundings, but she also found herself constantly anxious about security. Every unexpected sound made her jump, and she insisted on having multiple locks installed on all the doors and windows.
I know it seems excessive, Sarah told Elena as they watched the locksmith install a deadbolt on the back door. But I need to feel safe in order to focus on getting better. Elena understood completely.
The trauma of the shooting had shattered Sarah's sense of security, and rebuilding that sense of safety would take time and patience. Dr. Park continued the counseling sessions at Sarah's home, recognizing that the familiar environment might help Sarah feel more comfortable discussing her feelings. They worked on techniques for managing anxiety and processing the traumatic memories of the shooting.
Recovery from this type of trauma isn't linear, Dr. Park explained. You'll have good days and bad days, and that's completely normal. The goal isn't to forget what happened but to learn how to live with the memory without letting it control your life. As Sarah's strength improved, she began taking short walks around her neighborhood with Elena.
These outings were important both for her physical rehabilitation and for helping her gradually become comfortable being in public again. Initially, she felt anxious and exposed whenever they encountered other people, but slowly she began to relax and enjoy the simple pleasure of being outdoors.
The support from the community continued unabated.
Local restaurants provided meals, and neighbors offered to help with groceries and household chores. A group of elementary school students had organized a car wash to raise money for Sarah's medical bills, and their teacher brought her a check along with dozens of handmade cards. These children barely know you, but they wanted to help because they think you're a hero, the teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, explained. Sarah was initially startled by the teacher's last name but quickly realized it was just a coincidence.
I'm not a hero, Sarah protested. I was just doing my job.
That's exactly what makes you a hero, Mrs. Rodriguez replied. You were doing your job even when it put you in danger, and you continued to care about your patients even after you were hurt.
These interactions helped Sarah begin to see her experience from a different perspective.
While she still struggled with guilt and anxiety about the shooting, she was starting to understand that her dedication to patient care, even in the face of danger, represented something meaningful and important. As summer approached, Sarah reached a major milestone in her physical recovery when she was able to walk without assistance for the first time since the shooting. The moment came during a physical therapy session when Maria challenged her to walk the length of the hospital corridor where she had once worked. "I want you to reclaim this space," Maria said as they stood at one end of the familiar hallway. "This place represents your commitment to helping others, and you shouldn't let fear take that away from you." Sarah was nervous as she began walking down the corridor, but, with each step, she felt a growing sense of accomplishment. When she reached the end of the hallway, she turned around and saw Elena, Patricia, and Dr. Chen watching with tears in their eyes. "Welcome back," Dr. Chen said simply, and Sarah realized that she was indeed ready to begin the process of returning to the work she loved. 6 months after the shooting, Sarah Martinez stood at the entrance of St. Mary's Hospital, preparing for her first day back to work. The metal detectors and additional security measures were now in place, creating a different atmosphere than the one she remembered. However, the familiar sounds of a busy hospital and the sight of healthcare workers caring for patients reminded her why she had fought so hard to return to this place. Elena stood beside her sister, offering quiet support as Sarah took this significant step in her recovery. The physical therapy had been successful, though Sarah still experienced some stiffness in her leg during cold weather. More importantly, the psychological counseling had helped her develop strategies for managing the anxiety and trauma that occasionally surfaced. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Elena asked, noticing the slight tremor in Sarah's hands as she approached the hospital entrance. "I'm nervous, but I'm ready," Sarah replied, taking a deep breath. "I've been preparing for this moment for months. It's time to reclaim my life and my purpose." The security guard at the entrance recognized Sarah immediately and greeted her with a warm smile. Word of her return had spread throughout the hospital, and many staff members had been eagerly anticipating this day. However, Sarah had requested that her first day back be kept low-key, without any fanfare or ceremonies. Dr. Chen met Sarah at the elevator, his face beaming with genuine happiness. "Welcome home," he said simply, understanding that this moment was deeply emotional for everyone involved. "Thank you for being patient with me," Sarah replied. "I know it took longer than anyone expected for me to get to this point." "You took exactly the time you needed," Dr. Chen assured her. "Healing can't be rushed, and we're just grateful to have you back when you felt ready." Sarah's return to work was gradual and carefully planned. For the first few weeks, she would work only day shifts, avoiding the night hours when the shooting had occurred. She would also start with less critical patients, allowing herself time to rebuild her confidence and skills without the pressure of life or death emergencies. Patricia had volunteered to work alongside Sarah during her transition back to nursing, providing both professional support and emotional comfort. Their friendship had deepened during Sarah's recovery, and Patricia understood better than anyone the challenges Sarah would face in returning to the environment where she had been traumatized. "It feels different," Sarah observed as they walked through the emergency department. "But also familiar and comforting." The first patient Sarah treated was an elderly man with chest pain who had been waiting to see a doctor. As she began taking his vital signs and medical history, Sarah felt the familiar rhythm of nursing care flowing back naturally. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, and her voice carried the same calm reassurance that had comforted patients for over a decade. "Have you been a nurse long?" the patient, Mr. Foster, asked as Sarah checked his blood pressure. 12 years, Sarah replied, choosing not to mention her recent absence or the reason for it. "I love taking care of people." Mr. Foster smiled. "I can tell. You have gentle hands and a kind voice. That means a lot when you're scared and not feeling well." These interactions reminded Sarah why she had chosen nursing as her career. Each patient represented an opportunity to make a difference in someone's life, to provide comfort during difficult times, and to use her skills and knowledge to promote healing. The shooting had been a terrible experience, but it hadn't changed her fundamental desire to help others. However, Sarah's return to work wasn't without challenges. During her second week back, she was assigned to care for a patient who had been involved in a car accident. The man had suffered multiple injuries and was bleeding heavily, similar to the trauma cases she had handled throughout her career. However, as she worked to control his bleeding, Sarah was suddenly overwhelmed by flashbacks of her own shooting. Her hands began shaking, and she felt a wave of nausea as memories of her own blood loss flooded her mind. Patricia immediately recognized what was happening and smoothly stepped in to take over the patient's care while guiding Sarah to a quiet area where she could recover. "It's okay," Patricia said gently as Sarah struggled to regain her composure. "This is part of the healing process. You're not failing, you're learning how to work through the trauma." Dr. Park had warned Sarah that these episodes might occur, especially when treating patients with injuries similar to her own. They had developed strategies for managing these situations, including breathing exercises and grounding techniques that helped Sarah stay present and focused. After taking a few minutes to implement these coping strategies, Sarah was able to return to work. However, the incident highlighted the ongoing impact of her trauma and the need for continued vigilance in managing her psychological recovery. The article Sarah had written about her experience continued to generate responses from healthcare workers around the country. Many shared their own stories of threats or violence they had encountered, and several hospitals reached out to learn about the security improvements St. Mary's had implemented. Sarah decided to accept an invitation to speak at a regional nursing conference, seeing it as an opportunity to advocate for better protection of healthcare workers. The speech was scheduled for 3 months after her return to work, giving her time to build confidence in her recovery while preparing to share her story publicly. "I want to talk about more than just what happened to me," Sarah told Elena as she worked on her speech. "I want to discuss how we can support each other and create safer environments for everyone who works in healthcare." The conference speech was Sarah's first major public appearance since the shooting. As she stood at the podium looking out at an audience of several hundred nurses, she felt nervous but determined to make her experience meaningful for others. "6 months ago, I was shot 5 times while working in the hospital where I had dedicated 12 years of my career," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I survived because of the incredible medical team that treated me, the support of my family and colleagues, and the prayers and kindness of people I had never met." She went on to describe the importance of recognizing the signs of potentially dangerous situations, the need for adequate security measures in healthcare facilities, and the value of supporting colleagues who had experienced trauma. However, she also emphasized that the vast majority of patients and families were grateful for the care they received. "We can't let fear prevent us from doing the work we love," Sarah said. "But we also can't ignore the reality that healthcare workers face unique risks because we're present during some of the most stressful and emotional moments of people's lives." The response to Sarah's speech was overwhelmingly positive. Many nurses approached her afterward to share their own experiences and to thank her for having the courage to speak about such a difficult topic. Several hospital administrators took notes during her presentation, planning to implement similar security measures at their own facilities. Following the conference, Sarah was invited to join a national task force on healthcare worker safety. The group was working to develop guidelines for hospitals and clinics to better protect their staff while maintaining the compassionate, accessible care that patients needed. "Your perspective is valuable because you've experienced both sides of this issue," explained Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the task force chairwoman. "You understand the importance of security, but you also understand that our primary mission is patient care." Sarah's involvement with the task force provided her with a sense of purpose beyond her direct patient care responsibilities. She was able to channel her experience into advocacy work that could potentially prevent other healthcare workers from experiencing similar trauma. Meanwhile, her work at St. Mary's continued to progress smoothly. After 3 months back on the job, Sarah felt confident enough to return to night shifts and more complex cases. The anxiety and flashbacks still occurred occasionally, but she had developed effective strategies for managing them without compromising patient care. One evening, Sarah was assigned to care for Maria Rodriguez, a young woman who had been in a car accident. As Sarah took the patient's medical history, she learned that Maria was the daughter of Tommy Rodriguez, the patient whose death had motivated Carlos Rodriguez to attack the hospital. The discovery was emotionally challenging for Sarah, who had wondered about Tommy's family many times during her recovery. However, Maria was unaware of the connection between Sarah and the tragic events that had affected her family.
My father died in this hospital, Maria mentioned during their conversation.
It was really hard on my family, especially my uncle Carlos.
He never got over losing my dad.
Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions as she cared for Maria. She was saddened by the ongoing impact of Tommy's death on his family, but she was also grateful for the opportunity to provide excellent care to his daughter. In a strange way, it felt like completing a circle and honoring Tommy's memory. After Maria's treatment was complete and she had been discharged, Sarah spoke with Dr. Park about the encounter. The psychiatrist helped her process the complex emotions involved in caring for a family member of the man whose death had led to her own trauma. "This was actually a positive experience for your healing," Dr. Park observed. "You were able to provide compassionate care without being paralyzed by the connection to your trauma. It shows how far you've come in your recovery."
As Sarah's first year back at work concluded, she reflected on the journey she had traveled since that terrible night.
The physical scars had healed, though they served as permanent reminders of what she had endured. The emotional scars required ongoing attention, but they no longer dominated her daily life. Elena had returned to nursing school, inspired by her sister's dedication and resilience. She often visited Sarah at work, observing the same compassionate care that had motivated her to pursue nursing in the first place. "You're different than you were before," Elena observed during one visit. "Stronger, but also more aware of how precious life is."
Sarah nodded, understanding what her sister meant.
The trauma had changed her perspective in fundamental ways, making her more appreciative of simple moments and more determined to make each day meaningful. The hospital had implemented comprehensive security improvements, and no similar incidents had occurred.
However, Sarah knew that the risk could never be completely eliminated.
Healthcare workers would always face unique challenges because they worked with people during their most vulnerable and emotional moments. "We can't let fear control our lives or our work," Sarah told a group of new nurses during an orientation session. "But we can be smart, supportive of each other, and committed to creating the safest possible environment for everyone." On the anniversary of the shooting, Sarah returned to the exact spot in the hospital corridor where she had been attacked. She stood there quietly for several minutes, not in fear or sadness, but in recognition of how far she had traveled and gratitude for the opportunity to continue serving others. Patricia joined her in the corridor, understanding the significance of the moment. "Any regrets about coming back?" she asked. Sarah looked around at the bustling hospital, filled with healthcare workers caring for patients and families seeking healing and hope.
"None at all," she replied. "This is where I belong."
The story of Sarah Martinez had become more than just an account of survival. It had become a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of community support, and the importance of never giving up on the work that gives life meaning. Her journey from victim to survivor to advocate had inspired countless others to appreciate the dedication of healthcare workers and to support each other through difficult times. As Sarah returned to her work that day, she carried with her the knowledge that she had faced the worst that life could offer and had emerged not broken, but stronger and more committed than ever to the healing mission that had always defined her life.